Hey guys, Richard Holdner here. Here is the performance question for the day. Would you rather have less NA power and more boost, or more NA power and less boost? But there's always the question of cost. In this video, we're going to take a look at two different 5-liter Ford combinations. Actually, it's the same combination, but would you rather do this? Have a mild combination with more boost, or a wild combination with less boost to make the same power? Now here's the kicker. The wilder combinations also cost more. So would you rather spend more or just turn the boost up? To get things started, we're going to take a look at a 5-liter Mustang and find out what happens when we make naturally aspirated modifications, things like cylinder heads and camshaft and intake manifold. And then we will add boost to that. And then we can talk about what would happen if we made fewer modifications and just added boost versus making more modifications and adding less boost. Obviously, both of us can kind of get us to the same point. But here's our 5-liter Mustang. It was a 1991 or 92 5-liter Mustang, and we ran it stock with the stock 5-liter HO upper and lower intake manifold, the stock throttle body. This one had a set of shorty headers on it, but it had the stock E7TE heads, the stock cam, all of that stuff. So we ran it with, as I said, the shorty headers. We also ran it with an optimized tune, which they normally don't do from the factory. It also had no accessories, just an electric water pump, the way that we do it on the engine dyno. This particular motor produced 252 horsepower and 306 foot-pounds of torque. And again, that's with the shorty headers, although on this example, shorty headers are not going to add a great deal versus the stock, the factory 5-liter exhaust manifolds. But what we did was add a series of upgrades on this particular motor, and I've done this a lot on the 5-liter. We kind of know how they respond. But here's what happened when we put a set of long tube headers on it, and as they normally do, long tube headers kind of add power everywhere. So we had jumped up to 261 horsepower, and peak torque was up to 321 foot-pounds. And you can see, like with the long tube headers, the thing that I like is they gain a lot of power down low. That's scavenging, and that's not flow. A lot of guys just think that headers flow a lot more, but that's not why they added the power. They added from actually scavenging the exhaust, and they work pretty well in this combination. Then we added an intake manifold. In this case, it was a GT40 intake manifold, so we replaced the HO, the factory high output 5-liter upper and lower intake, with the GT40 stuff. And as we've seen many, many times over the years, the GT40 stuff does indeed add power. So our power output jumped to 279 horsepower. Peak torque was up a little bit to 323 foot-pounds, and we actually lost just a little bit of torque down low here in the 3,000 range, but not a lot. The GT40 works well, and the guys at Ford Racing sold about a bajillion of them. And what we did from here was upgrade it even further. We then added the Comp Extreme Energy 274 camshaft, and you can see that picked up quite a bit of power. Peak power was up to 312 horsepower, and peak torque was up quite a bit to 349 foot-pounds of torque. So basically, with a cam and a decent intake manifold on a 5-liter, this is what a lot of guys are running around. And again, this was still with the stock cylinder heads, which were definitely holding this thing back. And we know that because we added a set of aftermarket cylinder heads to this. In this case, they were aluminum heads from RHS, and I think that these were as cast versions. I can take a look at my test description here and see. Oh no, it says that they were CNC ported 215s from RHS. And run with the heads, the power output jumped up to 354 horsepower, and torque was up quite a bit to 378 foot-pounds torque. So now what was happening is we had good cylinder heads and we had a decent camshaft, but now the GT40 intake manifold was kind of holding things back. So what we did was put a different intake manifold on there, replacing the GT40. And this one was a slightly modified Holley Systemax manifold. It was ported by the guys at Extrude, and the power output was up to 395 horsepower. Peak torque was the same about. It was at 380 foot-pounds of torque, but it just shifted out a little farther. And you can see with compared to the GT40 intake, the Holley Systemax intake, lost power below 46 or 4700 RPM and then gained power out at the top. Different design, shorter runner, all of that stuff. So the GT40 is kind of more of a low speed deal. But these are the modifications run naturally aspirated, and this is what happened when we made all these mods to a 5-liter. So we're getting up near 400 horsepower, and we have exceeded 400 horsepower on a heads cam intake 5-liter before with the right combination of components. But now let's take a look and see, we can talk about what happens when we added boost to this thing. Now that we've covered the naturally aspirated modifications, we can take a look and see what happened when we added a single turbo kit. But here is our baseline motor, our 5-liter Ford, and here it is with the camshaft and the GT40 intake. And we can take a look at and see, here is what happened after we added all the modifications to it. The heads cam intake basically with the Holley Systemax and the RHS cylinder heads. But let's take a look and see what happened when we added our single turbo kit. You can see we produced over 600 horsepower, 622 horsepower, and 637 foot-pounds of torque. Now, the interesting thing with all of this, and the thing that we wanted to talk about today, is the fact that, two things. One, this was a single turbo kit from HP Performance. It had a 72mm Turbonetics turbo on it. It had an air-to-air intercooler. We ran about 21 degrees of timing on this. We ran a combination of 100 octane and 91 race gas in it. And we also had, unfortunately for us, 36-pound injectors, which if you do the math, you can't get there from here. And what we did was, that's why we didn't run this any higher than we did in terms of boost. This was about 10.7 pounds. And we basically ran out of fuel. And even to get here, we had to raise the static pressure up by about 12 or 13 pounds. I think we were over 65 pounds of static pressure, and we had a rising rate regulator also to get us to where we were, to make sure that we were able to dial this thing. And we ran this with I think with a fast XFI management system. So we just barely had enough fuel to do what we were doing. But that's why we stopped here, because there was certainly more power to be had. You can see the curve is nice and smooth and everything was working out well. But what we wanted to talk about here was not the fact that you can add a turbo to a 5-liter, which obviously you can, but which way would you go? And here's the consideration is, when we went from the cammed version, which made 312 horsepower, up to when we had the heads and intake manifold and added that to the equation, we made 395 horsepower. And those were good gains, but they're also fairly expensive gains. So here's my question for you guys, and I want you guys to let me know in the comments of the video. Would you spend the money on aluminum heads and a ported intake manifold, which might be several $1,000s, or why wouldn't we just go from the GT40 intake manifold and cam? And I use that as an example, not because you would have to buy a GT40 intake, but if you went to the wrecking yard, you could go get a 5-liter motor from a Ford Explorer. Now, it will already have two things that you'll want. One, it will have the Cobra style aluminum version of this GT40 intake manifold, which flows well, much better than a 5-liter HO manifold. And it will also have either GT40 or GT40P heads. So you'll be starting out with a combination that already has better cylinder heads than the E7TE heads that we had on this, and already has a good intake manifold, so you don't have to buy a GT40 like we did. So then if you added a cam to that, you'd have something that's probably more going to be closer to 350 horsepower, I'm thinking, with a good set of GT40 heads or GT40P heads, and this Extreme Energy 274 cam, and the Explorer intake manifold. So you'd be starting off with a little bit more power than we started off here. But my question is this: if you use that as your starting point, you could still get to the 620 horsepower number. You just have to do it at a higher boost level. And that's the thing. You wouldn't have to spend the money on ported heads and an intake manifold when you can just raise the boost. And raising the boost is as easy as just turning the knob. Now here's the question. Would you rather just raise the boost because it costs a lot less? Or would you rather have a combination that has more power NA so you don't have to run as much boost? Because as we know, if you go up in boost, you also go up in charge temperature and things. And in my opinion, there's more of a chance of detonation and things when you have to run more boost. but it's a lot less expensive. So my question is, again, which way would you rather go? Would you rather just go to the wrecking yard, get an Explorer motor, put a cam and springs in, and then add a very inexpensive turbo kit? You could even do it yourself. An inexpensive turbo and the right size injectors. Don't get 36s, definitely get something bigger. And then just turn the boost up. Because if your goal was 600 or 625 horsepower, you could certainly get there. You're going to run more than 10 pounds to do it, but it's very inexpensive. So make sure to let me know in the comments which way you guys would go. But either way, you can get to these power levels. And as we know, since this is a 5-liter Ford motor anyway, we're beyond the power and the torque output where you're probably going to split the block anyway. So this begs the question, do you really want to go up in power beyond this level anyway? And you guys can argue about that. So let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what's the takeaway from our testing with this turbo 5-liter Ford? And here's the takeaway. Obviously, you can go one route. You can do less mods or fewer mods that cost less money and just add boost to that. That's the low buck way to go. You can go with more mods like a set of TrickFlow 11R heads or a set of Airflow Research 185 heads, a good intake manifold, and then you have to add less boost to make the same amount of power. But the thing that interests me the most is that middle ground area that I talk about, and that's going to the wrecking yard, get a 5-liter Explorer motor that already has fairly decent heads. It already has a fairly decent intake manifold. So all it really needs is a camshaft and springs. Then you can add boost to that. And let's face it, you can probably get to the strength limit of the factory block anyway, because they're notoriously weak and then they just break in half at like 400 foot-pounds of torque. You can probably get there anyway just by adding boost. Now, sure, they're not going to make as much power at any given boost level as a good set of cylinder heads and a good intake manifold, but it can probably get you where you need to be. I'm Richard Holder. Thanks. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. More and more testing every day.